So it seems like Peterson is doing the right thing in bypassing belief. And what I would want to say, it's belief systems or belief in systems or belief through systems, because that language comes to us because when someone asks you what you mean by religion, these days the most standard answer is, well, it's your system of belief.
That's right.
So that word system attached to belief is a good hyphenated, sort of modifier, because we aren't talking about that wholehearted, action-oriented, emotion first.
It's the difference between law and spirit, ultimately. If that's what that's pointing out, because
absolutely,
all of our systems, philosophical systems, religious systems, etc., they're all law, right? So this is why to think that the only thing that's being criticized when law is criticized, to think that the only thing that's being criticized is the Torah is crazy. Welcome to Grill Country. My guest today is Brian Sartor, who's been a guest of mine on Grill Country before, and I welcome him back again. He reached out to me recently. Actually, it was like last week, and I tried to make this happen last week, but things came up. But we're here today to talk about a Jordan Peterson's God, because Brian had watched this video from an atheist YouTuber who had some maybe a little bit more insightful criticism of Peterson than some. And the part of her commentary that was insightful is that she sensed that that Peterson's position was based on a fear of nihilism. And I think that's essentially correct. But I would also say that it's good to have a fear of nihilism. So that's what we're here today to talk about. We're here to talk about Jordan Peterson's God. Let me go ahead, and Brian, you tell me about like how the wheels got spinning, why you reached out to me, and why you wanted to talk today. And in the meantime, I'm going to look for a clip that I wanted to play from one of Jordan's appearances.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here. What happened with me, Nate, is a long history of, I'd say, listening critically at first all by myself with Jordan Peterson, as I heard him speak in, 2021, 2022.
Right.
And liked what he said, but I also knew that there was some parts of it that didn't resonate with me completely, or that there was maybe something he was leaving out. And I was on the rest of that year pretty much was seeking to put some words to that and understand what it was. And I'm not sure I still have the words, but I felt like I kind of got it. Right. Meanwhile, my twin brother, Brad, and I see differently. He's a very interested listener to this little corner. Told me about you. I went with him to Jonathan Peugeot's Symbolic World Summit. I was not a participant, but I was just there in Tarpon Springs hanging out.
Oh, you
met
were?
a few people. Yeah, I
was there too.
I understand that. I wish we had gotten a chance. I wish we should make it happen. But so most of my listening to Jordan Peterson, even at first, was sort of critical. And I want to stop here. I want to stop here and say, being critical, I'm very much in the spirit of, I guess, what I read and see in you, Nate, which is, I don't think we have any enemies here, and we don't have any need to villainize or accuse or draw lines like that. So when I say being critical, that's something I want to make sure and say first, because
it's right. Though, Brian, it's right to be critical even of those that you perceive as your allies.
Yeah, end of
You
yourself
don't
too.
want to. It's actually a trap to just agree with people, because that's how audience capture happens, by the way, right? That's how audience capture happens, and people get like pushed to extremes. Even people with platforms, is that they just start they just start going along with whatever their audience wants, and they stop thinking critically about even what they're presenting, right?
Yeah.
So you need to be critical about your own thoughts and the thoughts of your enemies and the thoughts of your allies, because you have an imperfect picture of things.
The last time I was on here with you was about 6 months ago, and we were talking mostly about Jonathan Pajot, in that we were talking about a video that he and Richard Rowland did on St. Brendan.
Right. Yep.
So we ended up talking about the nature or the meaning of sacrifice, and I'm not sure how it became that, but I guess it's because it was very clearly to me.
No, because the way you pitched it at the outset was that you thought that there was a Girardian reading in the St. Brendan that was pretty obvious that Richard was avoiding.
Yeah, great conversation that day, and between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot, I've mostly listened to them critically through the conversation I've had with Brad, to try to be able to say what I see as a student in Forging Plowshares, which you're also a student in. I've visited channels and seen videos from TLC and Jordan Peterson and ARC and such, associations quite a bit. As I told you before, likely would not be here, likely would not be as interested in the deep dives if I wasn't in conversation with Brad, who is all in and all on board.
Right.
So when I heard recently her name, Britt, she does the No Nonsense Spirituality podcast. So we could find that and put the link up if you wanted to. It's not so much important what she said. I had heard Alex O'Connor have what I thought was a really decent critique of the whole setup that Jordan Peterson was in with the 20 atheists or whatever. But then after that, Britt at No Nonsense Spirituality made a video that talked about Jordan Peterson being mortally afraid of nihilism and sort of having this existential dread. And really, it was she's very psychological in her approach to things. And she's psychologized herself quite a bit in terms of deconstructing her faith.
Right.
So she's very much a theological, astute student of religion who actually in her graduate program, perhaps maybe, I guess it was graduate school, became atheist and nihilist and had kind of a mental and emotional breakdown. Right. So this was her approach, and she's talking about what she was seeing in Jordan Peterson and how vehemently he guards against that sort of ideology, which is nihilism. And this is also something I've identified in my talks and conversations with Brad, and even looking in on this little corner, it seems to be that is a core defense, a core reason for speaking out in a time of meaning crisis, to put some amount of
nihilism is the root cause. Nihilism is the root cause of the meaning crisis. Yeah. And the way that nihilism causes the meaning crisis is that if nihilism are true, none of your invented meanings are simply arbitrary, and that you have vacated the world of all meaning. Mm-hmm. There is no meaning left, and it turns out that human beings can't live without meaning, and which is why I think that you see nihilism spawn in its extreme, like I think nihilism is also responsible for spawning antinatalism, because it's kind of a logical outgrowth of nihilism. If nihilism are true, suicide is a logical response.
What's antinatalism?
Antinatalism is a movement that thinks that it's evil to bring children into the world and to have children because the world is so horrible, corrupt, evil, meaningless.
Yeah.
You know. So I mean, there isn't anything worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like Peter. So it's not Peterson's fear of nihilism isn't an irrational fear. I would argue it's quite a rational fear, because if nihilism is true, then what are we doing?
Yeah.
Right?
I like that how you redirected or brought it up and said, look, Brian, I don't want to talk about the whole, setup of Jordan Peterson.
I literally mean, what are we doing, by the way? It's like, what's the point of us getting together to talk about what Jordan Peterson thinks if nihilism are true? Because it wouldn't mean anything. It would have no meaning, nor would anything else that we do.
Okay, so I want to introduce, well, you can play the clip in a minute, but maybe, I guess.
I don't know if I need to play the clip, because Jordan, what I'm going to talk about, Jordan has said so many times that I think I can just I can do it without playing a clip from a channel that I don't know how they're going to respond. So let's avoid that. I do want to get into what I think Peterson is trying to do when he talks about God.
Okay, let's go with that first then.
What the atheists who he's making mad are saying is that he is essentially playing a semantic, and they're memeing it to death too. Essentially, he's just playing a semantic game where he questions the meaning of every word that you bring up in the conversation in order to obfuscate his meaning. But that's not what he's doing at all. What he's trying to point out that the atheists never get is that you're asking him to defend the idea of God as a proposition, which he has no interest in, because he doesn't see any utility. He sees no utility in that whatsoever. It's like the thing he always says is God is not a table, right? So the proposition God exists, like saying that this desk exists. I'll say desk because I have a desk on. This desk exists, and the proposition God exists. To think that those are the same kinds of statements is to completely misconceive God. And even the guy who got up on his high horse and said, "But I spent all this time studying theology and in seminary, et cetera, et cetera." It's like, if you spent your time studying God as a proposition, you still have no idea about the God that Peterson is talking about, because Peterson is talking about a God that is beyond propositions. Peterson is talking about a God where you don't look for him as an object in the world or a fact that you can find by looking somewhere out there. It's a God that is found mainly in interiority, that is more intimate to you than you are yourself. And so, and also it's a God, and one of the reasons he's so impatient about it, it's just the kind of God that everyone, if they take their own firsthand experience of life, everyone has contact with that God. Everyone. Regardless of how they want to describe their propositional position. Now, here's the thing. At times in our life, we move closer and further away from that God, when we're feeling distant from that God, when we're feeling in a place where we're feeling distant from that God, it can be hard for us to remember those moments when we were certain of his presence. Mm-hmm. But for all of us, atheist, agnostic, and believer alike, there are moments in our life where the sense of the presence of that God, who is very real and is a person, is very much undeniably present, and it's present to our senses. We just deny what our senses tell us because we have laid these propositions on top of our senses in order to deny what our senses are telling us in the first place. Give you an example of that. When you listen to a really beautiful sense of music that gives you a sense of awe, and connection to everything, you are in that moment experiencing God. You're having a direct experience of God. Now, the fact that you have a propositional castle that you've constructed to tell you that's not what's happening isn't my problem. It doesn't change what the primary experience actually is. So that's what Peterson is trying to get people to see. He's trying to get them. He's trying to get them to actually stop looking out there to try to find God out there. And this isn't surprising for a psychologist to do. The move he's making is to have them look inside. What things do you act out in the world? What do you behave as if you believe?
Yeah, you told me that
what do you value? Like, do you have experiences of awe and wonder? Like, that's the kinds of things he's trying to redirect people's attention toward, instead of these propositional fortresses that we erect to defend various propositional positions. He is directing toward a God that is not like, it's the kind of, and it's actually not surprising. He's a Jungian, right? This is why Jung says that he says I don't believe there is a God. I know there is a God. And the reason that he says no as opposed to believe is that he's wanting, like Peterson is doing consistently, he's wanting to push you away from propositions in your mode of understanding God, back toward a relationship to the real.
Yeah.
And that relationship to the real is found in our interactions with persons and in our actions with the rest of creation. So,
absolutely.
So Peterson's, so given that, why would you, now here's the thing, here's where I will critique Peterson. Knowing that's what you're doing, why would you agree to join a propositional game that is set up to be a propositional game where you actually have no possibility of reaching anyone with this very sophisticated, legitimate concept of God that you have?
I think it's because he has confidence in both. I think he knows that it's true that it's not contained in that, but he is talented, smart, gifted, and able to...
you can't point toward it. But it's hard to do that in that kind of situation where it's just like that kind of speed dating setup that thing had. It's very hard idea. To do that. That was a bad idea.
I didn't look at Alex O'Connor doing it, but I'd like to go back and see what the difference was. I know it's not to compare, but just I'd like to see how he handled it and how it unfolded. But what Jordan Peterson is doing on that front and that angle is good. And I think I would say he is doing good. And I think the drawing people in to think about these things at deeper and deeper levels is good. Your use of the word,
calling on people to embody it too, right? That's why he always likes to repeat Jesus's phrase to pick up your cross and follow him.
Yeah. So there's two things.
He's trying to tell you that whatever God is, the way you relate to God is found in the patterns of the way you act in the world. And if you align the patterns of the way you act in the world toward that vision of God, it turns out that it actually ends up making not only your life better, but the life of everybody else around you better, the life of community better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually something that you can, it's actually something that you can experimentally implement into your life and see what happens.
I like what you told me about your story, however many years ago. Jordan Peterson helped by telling you that faith is what you do.
Yeah.
Also, faith is the pattern, or it's conforming to a pattern of being. So I'd like for us to talk a lot about the word faith, and also in a critical way or a distinction-making way about the word belief, because Peterson is trying to avoid using the language and just using the concept as this is the gateway or the portal through which we know these things, belief. Like And I agree. I think that's good, because belief is, I've heard it said recently, I'll say it this way because it's what wants to come out. Belief is the enemy of religious faith. It's basically the word as we use it, and maybe even the word as we read back into Scripture, is a proposition-based.
Right, because because essentially the problem. Here's the problem with belief. Essentially, belief is the idea that you assent to something because it seems rational, by the principles of reason, seems to like best fit the evidence that you have, seems most probable, and therefore you intellectually assent to it. But the thing is that faith causes you to act before you know. This is why Peterson always wants to go to that Abraham story. Abraham doesn't have anything when he's called. He has nothing to base what he does. He acts before anything else. The will leads him.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of his being follows his will. His will moves towards God in advance of any of his intellectualization or anything else. God doesn't like speak propositions to Abraham that he then assents to and says, okay, God, that sounds great. I'll get up and do what you told me to do. No.
Yeah.
He's moved to action and he begins building a relationship.
Yeah. Well, so it seems like Peterson is doing the right thing in bypassing belief. And what I would want to say, it's belief systems or belief in systems or belief through systems, because that language comes to us because when someone asks you what you mean by religion, these days the most standard answer is, well, it's your system of belief.
That's right.
So that word system attached to belief is a good hyphenated, modifier, because we aren't talking about that wholehearted, action-oriented, emotion first.
It's the difference between law and spirit, ultimately. If that's what that's pointing out, because
absolutely,
all of our systems, philosophical systems, religious systems, etc., they're all law, right? So this is why to think that the only thing that's being criticized when law is criticized, to think that the only thing that's being criticized is the Torah is crazy. Because first of all, actually the Torah is the thing that is least like that. The Torah is not a system. The Torah is a call to action. There are things that you just do. Why do you do them? Because God asked you to do that, and God, and He is our God, and we have a relationship with Him, and He's asked us to do these things. So why would we not do them? Right? It's actually it's the least legalistic thing you can imagine. Actually, what's legalistic is when you build up a structured system around things, and things have to begin to like slot into these like propositional structures, and anything that falls outside of those propositional structures, you're just automatically rejecting.
And we have to say it's natural to do that. It's natural to see it happen in your own life, in your own community, in your own, we'll say, country, because this gets to some of what came up last year in the debate about civilizational Christianity, is that you can't have civilizational Christianity unless it is actually somehow attached to a belief system.
Right.
So,
yeah. And here's the thing. It's like, okay, so what we want to avoid is creating, it's all about like, okay, so we want to make some kind of addition to what we've received from God. Right. And I think at some point we are called to do that. we get tricked into what happens. The reason these systems are a problem is that we get tricked into, by putting the system making the system so important, we actually make our contribution, our addition to what God has gifted, more important than what God gifted us to begin with. And so we actually turn what was originally a gift from God into a mere given that is part of the system that we have constructed, and it loses its sense of giftedness. So we have to find better ways of making additions that actually continue the process of gifting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that requires us to have a kind of a radical openness. I just think that's why I'm still a liberal.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. And the reality of this openness that you're talking about, and that you embody really in your channel, your life, your relationships, and your conversations. Let's just go back to the beginning and say Jew and Greek. You got these two categories. They become one.
Yeah.
But we also have,
but how they become one is important.
Yeah. I hope we will talk about it. So, but more present to us, maybe, is really secular versus religious. So yeah. I think that's important to ask, how does faith express itself from a belief system or a way of being in the world that may have just an overwhelming doubt that God's God's conscious being.
Let's take a look at the origins of secularity. Let's take a look at that for a moment. I would say that secularity clearly grows out of the Protestant Reformation.
For sure. I think I heard recently more so it grows out of Augustine's concept of
there are definitely seeds. Yeah, there are seeds of it within the Catholic tradition for sure. Yes, for sure. City of God, City of Man. Yeah, definitely. There's an Augustinian strain there for sure that goes back for much further. But I think that the Catholic Church kind of kept that really from acting out too far in too much of a I think the presence of the Catholic Church with its hierarchical structure prevented that from really causing a truly secular space from emerging. I don't think you see a truly secular space emerging until downstream from the Reformation. And I'm not saying, but here's the thing. Well, that was inspired by the fact that the reason we made that move is because Christians were murdering each other over propositions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's why we made the move to secularity. We made the move to secularity in order to try to curb the violence that we were doing to one another.
I think
the motivation behind the foundations of secularity are good motivations, and they're Christian motivations, right? So the question is how do we? But the reason people are reacting to secularity now is that liberalism has started to crumble, because it's born out of in my opinion, liberalism is absolutely born out of the Christian idea of the person, that there's actually no way to get to a liberal political theory without having the Christian idea of the person in mind. Because the statement that, we hold these truths to be self-evident of the Declaration of Independence makes absolutely no sense if you don't have a Christian conception of the person as something that has inherent dignity because the person is created in the image of God. And I think that the entire liberal project actually is born out of Christian personal sensibilities. The problem is that secularity, while originally its purpose was to keep Christians from murdering each other over propositional differences, advanced to the point where we just wanted to kept religion out of the equation too much, so that we completely lost track of those Christian personalist foundations that began the liberal project. And I think that the challenge that we face now, I think Bulgakov basically has the right vision for what needs to happen in order to restore liberalism. In his philosophy of economy, I think that he lays out a foundation for a vision of liberal political arrangements that are more consciously Christian personalist. And I think that's what we need. And I actually don't like, I can see that there is room for cooperation and dialogue between this growing faction of post-liberals that is ascendant in the political conversation with Christian liberals like myself, because the bottom line is that what we need is a politics that is inspired by Christian personalism, regardless of whether you want to claim that that's a post-liberal politics or a liberal politics. At that point, you're just playing a semantic game.
I think you also don't even have to convince everyone that it's a Christian sourced value. You can say,
that's why I'm more liberal than post-liberal, right? Because I don't actually think that you need to explicitly coerce everybody into adopting Christianity. I actually think that's counterproductive.
Yeah, you meet the humanists where their deepest value is, and that's in the dignity of the human being. And if they don't believe in God, my thought is if you just tell them to look up and keep looking up, and God's there and God will show himself, that's maybe okay. But also, just for expedience sake, just look to your understanding of what it means to be human. That will get us a long ways, and you're not quibbling about belief systems.
But this brings us back to the Jordan Peterson's God conversation and why his fear of nihilism is completely rational.
We should come back to that.
Because, yes, this is exactly the moment to come back to it. And that's actually why I pushed in this direction. All these things are connected. You really can't separate them.
Don't I know it?
And this is the thing. It's this is why nihilism is really, truly the great enemy, because nihilism is the one thing that will make it so that you have no basis for accepting any idea of the inherent dignity and worth of the person. Then you're caught. So politically, you end up caught in a trap between competing collectivisms and atomized individualism with no personalist ground to be found.
Okay. Well, I don't want to be seen to be recklessly flirting with a harmful philosophy or nihilism in the sense of it's absolutely degenerative and takes us places that are destructive. But I will say, if I would take it back up to, maybe without calling the perspective nihilism, but to call it either secular or humanist, to say that we need that perspective, which is critical of belief, critical of our belief system. We need that perspective to actually understand our faith in the right way. So I say that because we have started talking about this because you and I both know Jordan Peterson very well. We both have listened to him for a long time and have had our own ears, minds, background that come to the things that he said, whether it was 4 years ago or 4 days ago. We know that he's changed. We know that he's on a journey. Mm-hmm. We know that there are these. Yes, and we know that there's some things that we agree on, that basically I think you're pointing to, and I'm not sure how to sort all this out. But the fear of nihilism being healthy was your contribution here, and I don't disagree. However, I think that I might even say it's a healthy fear, but at the same time, we need the criticism from that perspective to understand the move that God made of emptying himself and really being negated through death on the cross. So that's a lot to say. It's a lot to unpack, but it's where I wanted to go, at least from our agreement/disagreement about the value of, fearing nihilism. Because I think we do have probably a healthy fear for our society. We don't want our society to adopt, or our families to adopt bad philosophies.
I don't know if fear is the right word, but I don't know if fear is right. I did say fear too, because that's how the podcaster
described Jordan Peterson. He deathly fears mortal.
Well, yeah. Is it a fear, or is it a dedication to following a train of thought to its natural conclusion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that really being afraid of it, or is it or are you actually taking it seriously on its own grounds and seeing where it leads if taken? There's a lot to be said to as an intellectual exercise to take something and then follow it as far as it leads to see because that will give you an idea where it's leading you, right? So I just had I'll give you a positive example of this. I just had Jordan Daniel Wood's brother Shane on my channel, and we had a conversation about his book on Revelation. And his operating idea for his book on Revelation, which is called Thinning the Veil, is that the first 5 words of the book, a revelation of Jesus Christ, are telling you what the book is trying to do. And so he's going to take that, and he takes that thought and sees how far he can go using that as the interpretive key for the text, right? And it's just like, well, why abandon that interpretive key as long as it's still making sense of things? Okay. So, nihilism, you need to follow its own you have to follow its logic and take it to where it leads in order to evaluate it. And I think Peterson just correctly follows its logic to see where it actually leads. There are lots of people that try to put a happy face on nihilism and that are actually not really being intellectually honest about where nihilism leads, because they're actually bringing in other ideas from other sources in order to keep nihilism from going where it's leading you.
Doesn't it start and end at the death of God?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that's right. I think it starts with a sense. I don't think it starts with the death. I think it starts out of that. Remember what I said earlier in the conversation about that we're always aware of we're always aware at some level of the presence of God in our lives, but sometimes we still feel closer or further away, right? Okay, so what nihilism does is to take the experience where it is to begin from the experience where we feel most separated from God, and then it ends in the conclusion that the reason that we feel that separation from God is that God is dead. But here's the thing. Here's how you know how nihilism is ultimately self-refuting. Which you can that article from my friend Eugene Terrakin was kind of pointing in this direction, right? Because it's saying the very fact that you can declare God is dead is betraying your sense of missing something that you think should be there. So there's an even deeper interior part of you as a person that knows that God should not be dead. And so because you followed something that leads to a conclusion that your very own being is crying out against, should be your clue that it's probably not true.
Yeah.
So, and it can't be a healthy. It can be there can be a healthy kind of form of nihilism where you follow that all the way back, follow that all the way down, but then if you can follow it all the way down, but then come in contact with that deeper part of yourself that knows that God, yes, maybe God is dead, but he has resurrected from the ashes. And has risen on Easter morning, and is calling out to you. Then that can bring you back to him out of that nihilism, right?
Yeah, and that's what
when I go back and look at the poetry that I wrote in my agnostic, nihilist leaning days, I can see in my own poetry, I can see that part of myself crying out. Longing for the God that I thought was dead, that my mind told me was dead, but my heart knew was not dead. That's why my poetry was still calling out for that dead God.
Mm-hmm.
But my poetry was expressing truth that my propositions could not yet, because propositions kind of suck.
Yeah. Well, I think that's how we got here. And, you mentioned the Reformation and that theory of secularization, where it is certainly a product of developments within Christianity, within Christian thought. And you and I both have loved for a long time Ivan Illich, who tells us with this phrase that the corruption of the best is the worst.
Right.
So that when we see a Christian ethos, culture, the spirit of Christ, at least be the North Star of the pre-modern world, and then it's corrupted at some point. There's a corruption, and it becomes, the Kantian universalist ethic that is simply just legalism. That's all it is.
Well, yeah,
and it's the corruption. But it's the corruption of divine grace.
So Peterson actually knows
a coded
this
system.
Peterson actually knows this. This
is
why
talks about that. I don't hear him talk about it.
Well, this is not how. There was an interview I saw when I was kind of looking at things that Peterson has said in this. There was an interview he did with Matt Fradd, the Catholic apologist, and he was talking about why he gets irritated when Christians ask this question about him: do you believe in God?
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about the way in which that the Christians who make those demands on him are operating in the world like rationalist empiricists, and that's precisely right. That's precisely right, which is precisely that kind of like Kantian,
they're basically acting like atheists.
Right. They're acting. Yeah. Right. Exactly. They have the same. They're acting exactly like the atheists. Yes. Precisely. And it's like Peterson wants Peterson doesn't want to aid and abet that game because he knows that represents Christians and other religious people playing the wrong game.
And here's what,
if you're doing that, you're not playing the right game. That is not how God wants us to approach it.
Yeah, and so what's the game in that Peterson does recognize that Christians can, by going towards just simply propositional belief or belief systems, be basically playing the game of an atheist. And then, but I think he also implicitly knows this too, because of the people that he talks to all the time, is that you can also be a confessing atheist or agnostic and be playing the right game.
That's right.
Of faith, of the authentic human response to our existence.
So if the church begins to emphasize participation again over the propositional, then it becomes a more open space where all of a sudden people will be able to look at the church, and if the people in the church are actually like successfully living out the pattern of Christ in their embodied living, people will want to join your church. And if you aren't putting beliefism front and center and making what your church is about, the spectrum of people who will gravitate toward your church, who might not be yet on board with the beliefist elements of it, are going to feel more welcome in to that body to participate in what's going on. And then maybe they'll be able to form dogmas and propositions that like can be useful signposts, but that's all they ever are, is signposts. But that's actually not what's important. What's important is, do they come in and is the pattern of their life transformed, yes or no? If it is, then you're doing it right. If it's not, then it doesn't matter how sound it doesn't matter how good your signposts are to what you're pointing at, or how good your propositions are for what you're pointing at. Because if people aren't embodying it, then that really does have no meaning.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's that's the other good side of nihilism, is that nihilism is very useful against the hypocrisy and idiocy of our propositional structures. But those deeper truths that are not reflected in the propositions, but that are reflected in our embodied actions in the world, nihilism can't touch those.
Yeah, that's your poetry, Nate.
Right. Yeah.
Well, where should we go from here? Because I'm thinking that there's lots of options for us. Did you have any more questions for me about like what I might say about Jordan Peterson as a critique, or you were saying that you gave me the things that you looked at that he says repeatedly.
Yeah.
And we are in agreement, and we are on the same page about this very fact that, that faith goes in both directions, in a good direction when it's guided by the embodied and the personal experience and response to existence that is non-propositional, non-systems based at the core.
Okay, here's where I want to. This I think this might be the last thing remaining that I want to talk about. I want to talk about I want to take what we've said so far about approaching God in a way that is not so obsessed with our propositions, and I want to talk about what impact that will have on the forms of worship, right? I think that's kind of important, because I think that one of the things that goes alongside the propositionalism that kind of works hand in hand with it is a kind of obsession with particular forms, right? Where you can see this in Christian infighting, where Christians will just act as if people who are not Christian, because their form of worship doesn't match what my tradition, what my particular sub-tradition within the Christian family thinks it should look like.
Yeah, why do you want to talk about that? Because, I mean, actually, I should say I know that can be an issue and that people fight about it, or they did. But my question is,
wait, that was actually a blow up. Did you catch there was a blow up that happened on X over Jonathan Pajot he was visiting the Blue Mosque, and he made this comment that if megachurch evangelicalism were the only option available, he'd be tempted to become a Muslim because of the beauty of the mosque, right?
And the fella from North Carolina you were talking to about
McMo.
McMo, I saw that actually. Yeah. So I loved y'all's conversation, and I did, and maybe the question of those kind of bombs being dropped, and we love Jonathan Pajot too. I don't know him, but I know you know him better, and I listen to him quite a bit, and want to be respectful in my critique of him as well. But I kind of have a very similar thread or vision that I see for where Jordan Peterson, while it's good that he's raising conversation and having the conversation that he's having, there's limitations to it from a Christian theological perspective, but particularly that one that I've called it apocalyptic theology, or maybe neo-orthodoxy, but that's probably not the right word. But there's a way of doing theology and reading scripture that I have been learning at Forging Plowshares. That's basically Christocentrism, and explained in a way that has lots of implications, not just a simple sort of everybody's Christocentric, whatever. There's the heart of it being having huge impacts in these conversations going on all across these channels on TLC. And I think Jonathan Pajot also runs up against the limitations, because I think that both of them essentially have a form of foundationalism, modern foundationalism even, that is based on what you called law. I mean, there's the law of God in the scriptures, but then in Paul's letters, he doesn't at all times make a distinction between the law of God and just law as a guiding way of life, a mode of living that is in the sort of psychoanalytic way of seeing it. Is you got this external authority that you've internalized, and that is what Paul is describing in Romans 7 as the cycle of never being able to do what you want and always knowing what you want to do and not being able to do it. And it's called the body of death. It's called the death drive. It's called nihilism, basically. If you talk about living something out that's a dead end road, I think if Paul is describing that in Romans 7, and I think this is a key text for what I'm calling apocalyptic reading of the New Testament and the whole of Scripture, Christocentric, is
well, yeah. Well, I mean, Christ is the apocalypse, right? I mean, that's the
And why? But here's why. Why? Because God died.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that's
no, but that's no, yeah, but like that, yeah, that's true. Like,
God did die.
God did die and rose again on the third day.
Yeah, he rose again. But what is, I think, important here is recognizing that the canonic, not grasping equality with God, God leaving Jesus leaving the higher place in the hierarchy, so to speak, or in our understanding. Peugeot talks about God as beyond being or beyond consciousness even. So when we get to the top of the hierarchy, there's this leap that we can't see. We can't see beyond. So God's transcendent.
Well,
He's
God has to be beyond because he's the source. So he can't be contained within it. However, beyond consciousness, yes, but not beyond personhood, because this is the thing. There's a David Walsh book that I'm reading right now. It's called "The Politics of Person is the Politics of Being," and I'm just starting it. I haven't finished it, but I'm really enjoying it so far. And one of the things that he points out in his book is the way in which Heidegger, in his particular form of nihilism, is essentially seeking out the person, but it's eluding him, and that the Hasidic rabbi Manis Friedman, who's a very colorful fellow. One of the things that he said that I found very, very useful and important is he gave a talk once, and he talked about like monotheism being kind of no big deal, and that if you think that what Judaism's contribution to religion or the history of religion in the world is monotheism, that you're sadly mistaken, because monotheism is just kind of obvious, right? And actually, when you get down to it, most systems of paganism actually imply some kind of monotheism in the form of a unseen God. And so monotheism isn't particularly unique or interesting, and is kind of obvious. He says that the real unique contribution of Judaism is the recognition that God is a person.
Mm-hmm.
So a person is not, and a person can't be reduced to consciousness only, nor can it be reduced personhood. And I'm talking about human personhood now, and I'm getting this from Walsh, and I think he's right. Human personhood also cannot be reduced to merely being, because our perception of being is completely dependent upon our experience of being persons. So being a person is actually more fundamental to us than even our being. Which is also, and God is also a person, this is actually the reason why the God is more intimate to us than we are ourselves.
Well, if God's person, and I think we can say that. I mean, when we say things like, "Yeah, Jesus rose from the dead," after we say he died, and that God is a person because God is Trinity, and we know that God is in relation eternally to Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all together.
Yes. By the way, that's where I would, and I'm glad you went there immediately. That's where I would say, "Hey, Rabbi, then if God is person, then God is fundamentally a relation, correct?"
That wasn't what I was meaning to say in that case. That you should have said that, but I'm just.
Well, here's the thing. I have several Orthodox Jewish friends, and here's where and they will generally assent to the idea that God is some kind of multi-unity. It's just that it's actually Trinity that they have a specific problem with.
And I've understood that it's all through the Old Testament, and especially in the Jewish readings of the Old Testament, there is something of the Trinity that's formed even before Christian theology says it explicitly. Well, you've got the Oaks of Memory.
Robert Jensen certainly makes a very strong case in his systematic theology.
Yeah, well, when God died, and it was the movement of incarnation, or kenotic, self-giving love from behind the veil. Let's just use that language, because persons can pass between the veil. A conscious being, that's the question. I think Jonathan Pageau's description or definition of God being both being and non-being, both conscious and unconscious, or beyond consciousness.
Beyond either. I mean, beyond all of it.
But it's problematic if we don't factor in the Christocentrism of the move, and really there's two perspectives.
Well, that's
of the move.
right. But this is
both.
Yeah, that's right. No, but to kick it back to the Christocentrism and the context of what we're talking about, I didn't expect to be talking about this, but we'll go there. Like, this is what John is saying in his prologue. He's telling you that, I mean, he's not kidding. It is through the person of Christ that all things come into being.
Yeah.
Because person is prior to being by its nature. That means your person too. Like the human person, the person that we experience is prior to being. And I'm not talking about a temporal priority. I'm talking about ontological priority.
Okay. That's
temporality.
the perspective.
Temporality just confuses everything. I think.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about, because
I think temporality is a result of the fall, and that the conquest of death by death is also the conquest of time.
Well, let's just go ahead and say we got two perspectives. There are two perspectives. You got the perspective of time, and that's yours and mine, right? Originally, that's everyone's perspective. Who
I don't know about originally, but it's our perspective. It's our current perspective after the fall.
The people that we rub elbows and bump elbows with and fist bump, all the people around us, all of us, our perspective is from time.
Yes.
Now, we do have this concept of eternity, and you could even say that the concept was there back in Ecclesiastes, that eternity in our hearts, the concept is there. But in Christ, in Paul, these things are written.
Yeah, Ecclesiastes is an interesting place to point for eternity, though, because I would say that Ecclesiastes, like as a book, it is sort of a mournful reflection on the trap of the closed world.
Yeah,
because the eternity that is imagined in Ecclesiastes is one of eternal recursion.
And so is Job chapter 3, when he just wants to be buried and go down into the earth and never have been born.
Right.
I put the two things together, and this word that Paul uses in the New Testament once or twice, futility, is also the same word that the preacher used in Ecclesiastes. All is vanity, all is futility. Yeah. So meaninglessness. Here we're back to nihilism.
That's, by the way, those are both parts of nihilism. It's like Nietzsche actually celebrates eternal recursion as a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like, so you're definitely like, so clearly the ideas that become nihilism are things that, like, I think they're just products of the fall, and they come out of our own interior conflict with experiencing the reality of the fall, but sensing it should be otherwise. And it's our despair about that. And it comes out of our lack of faith in the possibility of that being transformed.
Yeah, well said. And along with those lines, I used to think wholeheartedly, as you were saying, that it was a result of the fall, until I recognized and looked closely at what Paul was saying in Romans chapter 8 about this word futility. He says that the sufferings that we, I won't get the words right, but this present suffering that we experience is not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us as we are revealed to be sons and daughters of God. So there's this future that and this is where the eternal perspective starts to come in as something added to what we were born with, this perspective of time. Mm-hmm. And we always have to, this is Bulgakov with the human wisdom and divine wisdom, the sophiology, that there's human wisdom in Ecclesiastes, right? And in the garden, there's this promise of human wisdom, and there's this journey of human wisdom, and human wisdom is a good thing. And human wisdom is what we're doing when we are talking about the meaning crisis. It's all religions, it's all perspectives. As long as there is some good faith will to connect with each other and not kill each other, we have is the development of human wisdom, and it goes in cycles, I'm sure. But this is from the perspective of time. And I've left Romans 8, but I want to go back because futility is my point. Paul says the whole creation groans.
Right.
And without getting the exact order right, he basically says, because it was subjected to futility by the one who subjected it in hope that we would become children of God. So I think that the futility and the meaninglessness of Ecclesiastes, and even the mystery that Job didn't know, Job was of the perspective that with all this that's happened to me, how can you be good or up to anything good, and this be the case? And I'm righteous, and my friends have all these theories, but God never gave him the answer. Mm-hmm. But I think Paul is saying, without referencing Job directly, I think he could be referencing Ecclesiastes and Job when he uses the word futility. But I'm convinced that it's creation, the act of creation, even prior to fall, or maybe they were sort of, these things happened all at the same time, that we were subjected to time. Mm-hmm. We were subjected to the limited existence of being human. And this is like the seed. So that what comes to us in the gospel is actually a revelation of the mystery that's never been revealed. We now know God is no longer hidden.
Right.
He is in his full display of who he is at heart, merciful, and the foundation for all wisdom, divine and human. Where that's revealed is on the cross, that he dies.
Yeah.
And so we need the perspective of nihilism.
Well, here's what I would say. Okay, go ahead.
To break our system's foundationalist approach.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, that is. I kind of granted that utility to nihilism before. Is that nihilism is useful as a tool in order to show our incompleteness without God, right? Which is what the futility is. That's what the futility is about. Is like you think that you can live without God. Okay, well, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
We can drop the ism, because futility may be a better word, because it's just as true. And nihil or nothing, futility,
Right. Yeah.
us being amounting to nothing under the sun, apart from apart from what is revealed.
So here's how I would want to say this. Here's how I want to say this. I would say that nihilism is the truth of the closed world.
Yes, it is.
It's actually the truth of the closed world.
It's the highest wisdom.
If the world is closed off from God, and God is indeed dead, then nihilism is necessarily true.
Well, except that we don't want to promote the emotional and willful response of degenerate behavior, self-destructive behavior, and suicide, right?
Well, here's what I would say, though, is that the closed world is never the whole story, right?
Exactly.
Like, there's always, and this is like, and Christianity is not the only religion in the history of religions that has promised escape from the trap of the closed world. I think that's Eastern religions, like particularly like Hinduism and Buddhism, are very much focused on the escape from the closed world part of the equation. What's unique about Christianity and its fundamental gospel of Christ crucified and resurrected is that it actually doesn't offer only escape from the closed world, but the transformation of the closed world from within.
Yes, and I think that Romans 8 gets to that. It makes, I won't say it, well, Paul is talking about suffering. And when he mentions the sufferings that I wish I had brought my Bible into the room. But anyway, the sufferings that cannot be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. Remember, there's two perspectives. So from the perspective of time, that suffering is crippling and makes no sense. And that's what Job knew.
Right. But
from the perspective of eternity, which we only have because God entered time as a human, as a finite man, he subjected himself to futility and considered equality with God not something to be grasped. We can talk about grasp a lot because that's really where we go wrong. We grasp the fruit, or we consider equality, or we consider equality with God not something to be grasped. But when that is occurring, Jesus actually dies. And that's the way Philippians 2 ends up saying that he suffered death, even death on the cross. But I like to think of it is that, I think you said it the other day when you were talking to, I don't know his name, McMo.
Oh, McMo, yeah.
About McMo. That time is a double helix with the cross.
Oh yeah, that's actually cool. It was a paraphrase from something that Robert Jensen said.
It's an important visual, because what I'm saying is, if you could picture the circle of if we'll just stick with the double helix, that entering from eternity, whatever it would look like for God to enter time as a man. We saw it happen from our perspective. But he died on the cross, which is right in the center. But his resurrection, this is a different way of thinking about it, I know, than we're used to hearing on these channels. His resurrection is not him turning around and going back up. He passes all the way through, and out the other end of the double helix, which is time, he's in eternity again. So the end and the beginning are all one. The top and the bottom are all one, but the direction is always down. the direction from our perspective in time is always self-giving love and self-sacrifice for the other. There is no duality there.
Right.
So I'm saying that in slight hesitation because I haven't thought it through completely. I think that double helix thing just came to me today. But the main thing is that we have two different perspectives, time and eternity. And we must keep that on the table and recognize there are many people who don't have the metaphysics in their mind of, yeah, there's a God out there and that God is eternal, and somehow, how could they? And how could we really?
Right. And I ultimately don't think God cares about our metaphysics.
Right. And I think that's where the Hegel stuff comes in, because I think what Jordan Daniel Wood and Paul Axton and all these deep conversations about Chalcedon and Maximus the Confessor and Christocentrism in that vein, taking up Hegel as I call it a language, that it's the end of metaphysics, in that there is no beyond, there is no transcendence anymore. It's not that there's no eternity. Yes, there's eternity. So you have two perspectives of time, but you don't have the dualism of here and there. Mm-hmm. And you don't have the dualism of God as being and non-being. You have the reality that there's two different perspectives, but God is a person.
Yeah. Well, I think
one
of the things that opens up in the wake of nihilism and the kind of the deconstruction of the old metaphysics that was primarily substance-based metaphysics is that it does actually open up a new, relatively unexplored metaphysical space that is kind of a challenge that's just now starting to be met by some personalists, which is to actually build a metaphysics that takes person as its starting point. Mm-hmm. That treats person as the most fundamental reality.
Well, let's think about starting points, though. Because
I think Jordan is given a Christian language. I think Jordan, in his work, The Whole Mystery of Christ, in his understanding of Maximus, I think he's given us a Christian grammar for precisely that.
Absolutely. And Paul Axton is really working through. If you haven't, the sermon he posted yesterday morning, for those listening, you can find Paul Axton's podcast. They drop twice a week. It's usually an interview or it's one of our class times, and he preaches every Sunday, and that's usually one of them too. But yesterday was a sermon on June the 21st. Mm-hmm. The title was, dang it. But it was something about time and eternity. And he's given the best explanation of Hegel's importance in this sermon that I've ever heard him give. And he's been nailing them like week after week and class after class, making these connections in his own experience and thought as someone who studied Hegel from the perspective of Slavoj Žižek. And it ended with him in that nihilist perspective that you can't get out of, your traps. Žižek said Paul got it right in Romans 7. He described the human predicament, and Romans 8 doesn't count because it's not true. So
that's the choice. That's the choice. I think when we had our discussion, like trying to frame what this conversation is going to be about, I pointed back toward David Bentley Hart's 2003 essay, Christ and Nothing, I really think that's kind of like, those are the options that are left to us here at the end of history. Which is not to say that, here's the thing though. I want to qualify that to a certain degree. I think that Christ, when I say Christ, what I mean is the pattern of personhood that Christ is calling people into. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about a proposition or a set of propositions. And I'm talking about the actual person of Christ, which is where you came from. It's your source.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I like the word source, and that seems to me the implied meaning, or possible meaning, will say, of the word Father in Jesus's lips, on Jesus's lips.
Yep.
Peugeot was talking about the meaning of Father being the one who gives you your name, and the one who sort of is at the top. And I think that's the metaphysical perspective, that you can see God as the top of the hierarchy, and then he's also beyond the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. But if we're at the end of metaphysics and Hegel actually is useful at all, like Origen tried to make Plato useful for Christianity, Hegel was Christian, and that's where he shortchanged, is that it is the person of Christ and the spirit of Christ that is.
I think it's the end of an old metaphysics, but it is actually just the beginning and the dawn of the possibility of the new metaphysics that instead of asking the terms of asking the fundamental questions in the language and understanding of substance, begins to ask those fundamental questions in the register of person. And like I said, I actually think Jordan's book is a really, really good beginning toward creating a Christian grammar that is working toward that new kind of metaphysics. When he says things like, that the person of Christ is the foundation of both identity and difference. Like you're working a completely different set of a different logic too. That's why he uses the term Christologic in his book. And I think Hegel is an important philosophical support for what Jordan's doing, because I think Hegel has similar intuitions and is kind of trying to move in a similar direction.
And Jordan Daniel Wood's language and content and insight also makes, along with Maximus, the time be sort of, the beginning is in the end and the end is in the beginning.
Right.
And the recognition that what we are so used to calling a duality of spheres or realms, there's, the above our ability to grasp, and then there's the immanent. You got transcendence and immanence. That's it. I mean, that is metaphysics, and Plato was a nice
and the old metaphysics
language.
And the old metaphysics wants to always keep them separate.
But we have to recognize what it hit me like a brick when John Baer said it, that if there's a divide between God, the creator, and the human as creation, things change with the incarnation. There's a scrambling of that old
precisely
view
right
of things.
So that means that, right, precisely right, and I think that is Jordan is very much in his work pointing that out, and I think it is it's a place. I was actually thinking about this because I just I had the algorithm feed me a small channel, had a conversation between Jordan and Larry Chapp that happened last week, 4 or 5 days ago.
You cut out. What was it?
Oh, did I?
Algorithm what? Yeah. Just a little bit.
Yeah, the algo like kind of fed me this small channel conversation between Larry Chapp and Jordan Daniel Wood, where they were talking about whether Thomistic grammar was necessary for Catholic theology going forward, and it was the part of the conversation that caught my attention was actually they were talking about analogy and how analogy was necessary in metaphysics. But I think that if you transition from a metaphysics of substance to a metaphysics of person, then you actually end up having to collapse analogy.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, and think that, I mean, if Jesus is the fullness of God in bodily form, he is that which is signified God. He's the transcendent God. I mean, he just is. But he's also the very present, you could say, sign of the transcendent God, but he's not just a sign, he's the signifier. So they become one. Right. You have the closing of that gap. And there's so many different ways we could talk about this. We could talk about the subject and object. We could talk about thought and being, the sign and the signified, law and spirit, or work, spirit of the law and letter of the law. There's a solution that what you're pointing to as personhood brings to the old problem of that dualism and the gap between God and the human, and the tension of Jesus being both God and man. And we think if it's tension and we take that into ourselves, we, with Martin Luther, have to say God's hidden, that there's this, I don't know, there's just a sort of a nominalism that goes with the both and of, yes, God died on the cross, but also the real God we can't know.
Right.
That's I think Hegel is getting it right if we read him Christologically. Mm-hmm. And he wrote Christologically, is what Jordan Daniel Wood and Paul Axton, in my view, this is what they're saying, and they are, plumbing the depths of how this helps a lot of our theological problems, East and West. It helps. It's a whole new language and a whole new model for understanding the existence of a God-man in the center of our thought and world and theology and life. So I think that's important, and I think that.
Well, it's not the fact of his existence, or even the fact of his resurrection.
The implications.
It's actually the whole life. The whole life presents to us a pattern that is possible for us to enter to in our own life.
It's his presence, which is.
That's why I use precisely right.
It's his spirit. It's his. It's his body, because we are members of his body to each other, and he's the head. And the reality of God's, the formerly known as transcendent God, is not transcendent anymore. And that's not a part of classical theism.
Right.
It's what is new when you have the concepts, the way of talking about it that Maximus the Confessor and I think Hegel help us get away from the trappings of the old metaphysics.
Right. That brings me back to maybe we can still talk about like what this should imply about how what emphasis we put on in our forms of worship. Maybe we can get back to that, but because we kind of never actually addressed that at all. But
My fault.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I think what was I going to say? Can you repeat the last thing you said? Because I actually.
Well, just the move from Plato to Hegel.
Right. That wasn't what I wanted to say, though. I sidetracked myself. I actually sidetracked myself by trying to hold two thoughts in my brain at once.
I can't even pretend to try to do that.
Well,
interrupt me. Okay, interrupt me. But I really think that the language, I call them languages because they're not inherently containing the truth of Jesus' personhood and being. Either right. One of them. I think Plato was helpful for a long time and maybe still helpful for many, but also we should be open to the fact that Plato, I think probably the best theologian early who did his best to take Plato as far as he could go was Origen.
Right.
And he's not real popular.
Yeah.
He just he's misunderstood, and it wasn't the vision of God that caught on for Christendom. We'll put it that way. You know, the Augustinian split. We referred to it earlier. That city of God and city of man.
I know where I want to take this now, and this is probably where you end up landing the plane. I think you're right. I think that the vision of God that Christendom took up, was it was shaped by the scholastic tradition in Catholicism, and then by the kind of modernist inclinations of the early Reformation, early modern thought, and it kind of lost the kind of sensibility that it had in parts of the patristic age. And it seems like we're only now kind of returning to doing theology in that way again. And maybe I think there's the possibility that we can go even further than some of those early church fathers like Origen he brought up were able to go. And I think that's why Peterson is standing where he's standing outside the church, because I think that the way God is using Jordan Peterson, what Jordan Peterson's function is to correct the direction of the church from the outside in terms of the way it's talking about God.
That's interesting because I was very, I was maybe not that clear in what I said a while ago, the fact that we need the perspective of atheists, agnostics, in order to expose the systems reliant nature of our belief.
Right.
And he's one of them.
Right.
Peterson's one of them.
Yes, he is. And
in a way.
No, he is, because he is pointing out the weaknesses in our systematizing, although he's doing it from a direction where he's ultimately pointing back toward God. But
yes, from the Jungian perspective,
right,
but it's fresh.
Right, but from a different perspective. But I would say that atheists are also kind of the healthy function of atheists is that atheists are really good for pointing out idolatry. Yeah. They're really good for pointing out idolatry. But they are really good. Yeah, they're very good at pointing out idolatry, and I think that's like kind of the healthy function of atheism, is that they're good for deconstructing people's idols. The problem is that atheists have their own idols.
Oh yeah, well,
that they're not so good at spotting.
So
So
I know we're kind of limited on time. We must be, and we can talk again some other time. I think, but I'm happy to stay on as long as you can today. You have to let me know.
Okay.
I think that we've hit on a lot of the complexities, we'll say, that Jordan Peterson embodies and represents for this little corner, and those of us who are all seeking to be faithful followers of Christ. And I think I said this way, I would like to see more of what you and I get at Forging Plowshares, which really I've thought about it. I mean, I don't know how much Jordan Peterson talks about this kind of thing, or Peugeot even does. But I'd like to see more theological content in this little corner that is representative of the Forging Plowshares content. And it seems to come back to this whole metaphysics thing, that the time and eternity, the importance of, I mean, we're speculating is what we're doing. Let's just be honest. Origen was speculating, and I might even say the Apostle Paul was speculating, drawing inferences from what he saw as the God, as Jesus was God, and he said things in Scripture that we keep coming back to that are absolutely, they're at one hand simple, and we know what he means, we get it, but on the other hand, you can write books on one phrase, right? And so it's all speculative. So I think it's good and right and true for us to, one, do a little bit of deconstruction if the old metaphysics is propping up our faith with the old system of belief. And I do see that even though there's a fresh Jungian perspective and approach, and Jordan Peterson is amazing at what he called, and I'll refer to this video that was most important for me in preparing for this, investigating identity from first principles, which I think he released back in late December. And the title of that video is We Who Wrestle with God, in the Image of God. And it's from late December 2024. What he does in that lecture is amazing. I think it's about as far as he could possibly hope to go.
But to point toward identity, the moment you make the move to point toward identity, you're actually starting to gesture toward a metaphysics of person. Because identity is inherently a concern of persons. You know, a giraffe doesn't have any questions about its identity. A dog doesn't have any questions about its identity.
Yeah.
In order to have identity questions at all, you have to be a person. So in pointing toward questions of identity as being fundamental to our understanding of reality, you're beginning the process, and you're talking about from first principles, you're working on a metaphysics based in person. which is a sensible thing for a psychologist to do, because that's what they study.
The limits of it from a theological perspective, and especially the apocalyptic, Christological, Christ-centered perspective that I'm talking about, is that he does all that without referring to what I'm calling the time and eternity perspectives. I mean, there are two perspectives. It's that he so beautifully describes the limits of our ability to know as we look down what our foundation is. Mm-hmm. We look back into evolutionary history. We look down into finite, or supposedly finite, but really infinite particulate concepts of matter, and how we're actually standing on the ground where we're standing right now, when it's more space than matter. You know, he just has this beautiful description of the limitations of our ability to say what is concrete at bottom in our identity. And when you reach up, you go into the further and further into the realms of trying to understand with religion what it means to be reaching toward the infinite and the non-material. He rightly says that it's infinite there too. There's no way that we are reaching something that tells us what our identity is, but it's the process of what he calls in the Passion of Christ is the hero story. He calls it voluntarily taking up the burden of being unto ourselves and moving forward and upward to the cross, in spite of that most extreme catastrophe and adversity of what it could possibly mean to be human, is to take up your cross and move upward, keep looking up while you're facing the catastrophe. And the promise, he said, is that the spirit of life and the cosmos will be with you when you do that. Mm-hmm. So he says all that towards the end of the video. But ultimately, I'm not convinced that he's crossing the gap that is there between the infinite and unknowable God and the center of our operation, ourself, our identity, and who we are. So what I'm saying is valiant effort, but I think it actually falls short in the end.
Yeah,
you need that theological.
It's something like Peterson is standing like somewhere like Kierkegaard's night of infinite resignation, but it is not yet a night of faith in what he says there.
Yeah, and so that's not meant to be a critical or a commentary on his faith or not, but it's what is Christian teaching and what was Paul saying in his letters, and what has the faith, the faithful of Christian reflection and prayer. What is it?
So he may not. Okay. So here's the thing, though. He is kind, in a way. He is. I think I'm not sure that he's not closing the gap, because he's still urging people to pick up their cross.
So it does. It does include suffering, but it doesn't include the eternal perspective on suffering. And maybe that's quibbling or splitting hairs. But and I don't want to answer you too fast. So you're making a good point. You're right.
My point is that the remedy to the crisis of identity that confronts us, that he's talking about, the remedy is to aim toward the infinite and pick up your cross.
Yeah, and that's doing something, and it's following the pattern. What did we say? That faith or belief is best described as conforming to a pattern of being. It's that. So I don't want to say that it's void of faith, but here's
okay. I'm gonna throw you a curveball here for a second. I was thinking about this earlier in the day when I was thinking about our upcoming conversation, but I never brought it into the conversation. I meant to bring this up early when I was talking about what Peterson is cautioning, the beliefism that Peterson is cautioning against. And the reason I'm going to dive into this example is because you're wanting to talk about it in terms of the problem of suffering, right? Okay. So are you familiar with the Enzo novel Silence? Okay. So here you have an example of someone who makes the choice. Actually, I guess I should say, so essentially what you have is you have a missionary to Japan who he's not afraid of being martyred for his own safety, but the Japanese officials are clever enough to figure out that even though the missionaries aren't afraid of being martyred themselves and are willing to martyr themselves, if they can visit that suffering upon the people that they have been ministering to instead, then that might cause him to break. So the character is forced to apostatize in order to save the people that he's been ministering to.
Yeah.
So the question is, right. So the question is that raises is, well, was he being really Christian? And I would say unambiguously, and I think Jordan Peterson would agree with me, yes. In apostatizing, he took the most Christian course of action possible because he was still embodying the pattern of Christ's actual being by setting down what's important to him and letting go of his pride and his ego and his way of doing things in the world in order to save people's actual lives. And so when Jordan says, aim toward the highest, pick up your cross, is he really being a knight of infinite resignation? I don't think so, because it goes back to what I said about Abraham. It's like you act first. God wants us to act first. You got to kind of get yourself moving in the right direction, and then once you're moving in the right direction, then God will draw close to you, and then you will actually experience His presence. But you got to get going first.
Mm-hmm. Well, this doesn't have so much to do with suffering, but I wanted to introduce a word that follows that point. If you're going to act, what determines whether or not it's grasping at the fruit or responding out of faith in the promises of God? They're both actions, but there's a difference. And there's a word that I have become very comfortable using about faith, is that faith is the mode in which you act.
Okay.
So mode may not be a perfect word in other ways of using it, but it gets at something for me that Paul is describing in Romans in particular, where he names faith as something which replaces law, hierarchy, I mean, he doesn't use the word hierarchy, but I'm transferring. The word law is the catch-all word that I think Paul rightly uses to name systems thinking, proposition, and fruit that, well, law is the method, and it's the mode, the spirit, the letter of the law, distinguishing between what's good and evil, knowing good and evil. That's a mode that we can act in and pursue knowledge in and think we know something in, and maybe even we can learn. So let's talk. Things.
Yeah. So this is something I get from.
But faith is the opposite.
Tomberg says this. Tomberg says this. This is where Tomberg would be Tomberg's addendum to Peterson. What Peterson's recommendation of action, right? Tomberg says this. He says, anything that is done, that is actually done. So any deed you can actually do that is actually a deed, it's a miracle. And it's a miracle because all the things that are not truly done just happen automatically. So if I am acting in the world to pursue my self-interest, I don't need to do anything. That just happens automatically. And so he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to point toward an example of something that is actually done, right? Which is a place where Illich also points to look at as an important place to act. So the Samaritan's actions, which are conceived beyond the available cultural frame, and are truly miraculous in coming into being, they're a miracle.
And they start in his gut and shatter norms.
Precisely. And the same thing goes for like some of Jesus's really hard sayings, like love your enemies, right? Well, why love your enemies? Because loving your friends is automatic. You're not doing anything in loving your friends. In loving your friends and hating your enemies, you've done nothing. There's no freedom in that. It's just you. It's just you obeying your nature. That's it. That's all it is. There is no miraculous intervention of God in that action. So those are the things that we. So when we were talking about picking up our cross, the things that we're called to do in picking up our cross are miracles. Are miracles, and those can only come to us from being in a place where we are aiming toward God, trying to draw near to God, and we can hear the sound of His voice. You know, so there's the whole idea. There's midrash that the day of the Lord is the day when we hear God's voice, right? Because you know the from that Old Testament scripture, when you hear my voice is actually connected to the day of the Lord. Like that's the day when we hear God's voice is the day of the Lord. Now that day arrives for us at different times in our lives. This relates to when I asked Shane Wood, given that he wants to read Revelation take it seriously as far as he can, as to be a revelation of Jesus Christ, I asked him, well, how does this make you begin to think about the parousia? And he was willing to follow me in saying that, well, when we start thinking about it in that way, then when Orthodox Christians say that the saints are already living in the eschaton, they're saying something that's true, and that when we hear the voice of the Lord, it is the day of the Lord for us, and we can live into
time and eternity thing.
What was that? We can live into eternity now. Yes, that's what.
Yeah, it's the time and turn. Yeah, when I say it's two perspectives, we have both. We have both at the same time, and that makes me bend that way with Day of the Lord, eschatology, history, I mean, we don't know. We just don't know. And I don't know that we have to see Revelation and the end of time as something that, I don't know. We certainly need to read Revelation a lot more and have more conversation about it to get anywhere. And it's such an like y'all were pointing out, such an underused liturgical text in Orthodoxy, particularly. I think is what you were saying.
Yeah, they don't include it. We do in my tradition. We do read it.
Oh, Episcopalian. It's in the liturgy.
I'm ACNA, but yeah.
Oh, well,
if I lived in a more conservative state, I might attend an Episcopal church, but I don't. So I don't.
Anglican. What's ACA?
ACNA is the Anglican Church in North America.
Okay. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about faith as a mode over, against, or different from belief systems. So we can talk about that another time, but that's been huge for me. And I like what you're saying about true acts, true actions, and doing anything.
Anything that is truly done is a miracle.
Yeah. I mean, because that follows the whole futility thing. If you're just going through the motions of the letter of the law, it's complete futility and nothingness and pointless. And we're all born in that, right? I mean, that's the other place Paul uses the word futility is in futility of mind, just the way you were before Christ was formed in you, or, pointing to, I think that's the other place besides Romans he uses children of wrath. But all of it.
Yeah. Final thoughts on Jordan Peterson's God?
Well, my final thought is I would like to see more conversation in this little corner about what the parameters of, I call it the Overton window of this little corner has been, theologically. And it would cause us to engage more seriously some of the critiques from this perspective of Jordan Peterson's God and the approach to Jonathan Pageau's whole approach of the symbolic world, which I read as and absolutely see it operating as law. That there's law that underwrites all symbols, and the law and the pattern and the hierarchy is itself something that we can attend to, of course, or see, even conceive of, and know anything about in two different ways. And I would like to see us talk about the limits, or maybe I just call it the limits, because it can lead somewhere, but I do think that we can get lost in symbols. We get lost in Jungian psychology. We can stay lost. It's not like it's the worst place to be ever, but at the end of the day, there's a futility that we actually want to transcend through our personhood and through our interaction with one another, with our prayers, with our worship, no matter what form it takes. We can get back to that. I really think that the quibbling over forms of church, also the necessary ways that we resist nihilism or the left, the necessary ways, the ways we think it's necessary to conceive of civilization as Christian. Back to that whole, Christian civilization question. And, I've tried to introduce congenially and want to talk about things that I feel like aren't represented in the corner. And there's a whole host of things, a whole range of things that I feel like I don't want to come and break anything. I don't want to come in and be an irritant. I like to be part of the conversation. And I see you as someone who understands both worlds. And the two worlds I'm talking about are Forging Plowshares, the school. I mean, I'm not a teacher, I'm a student there. And this little corner, which I haven't participated except for having a couple of videos with you and listening in a whole lot. Mm-hmm. I've written probably a couple of emails to you and PBK and Jonathan Pajot to sort of say, I think there's some substance to this critique of Jordan Peterson. And, I think that is currently outside of the Overton window in this little corner and maybe for good reason. Maybe that's just the way it is.
I would actually say at the moment, the corner is very open to critiquing Jordan Peterson because, oddly enough, largely because of Pajot's influence. Because I would say that, in terms of political trajectory, this little corner is leaning in very, very heavily in a post-liberal direction. And Jordan Peterson, like myself, is one of the last few remaining staunch liberals around. And so that puts Peterson at odds with a community that developed around interest in his ideas, because they have kind of gone beyond him, mostly under Pajot's influence, in a different direction politically. But politics and theology always collide. It's almost impossible to keep them separate. And I would say that essentially the difference between the Forging Plowshares community and TLC is that TLC is a community that's a combination of Orthodox, Reformed, and we have a few Pentecostals, some Catholics, but we have exactly one Anabaptist, Julian, who's been on my channel several times. So there's not a whole lot of Anabaptist perspective. And I would say that the theological sensibilities of Forging Plowshares very much comes out of the Anabaptist tradition.
Yeah,
so,
I think so too. Although there are a lot of... There's a great big heart for orthodoxy in there as well.
Yes, for sure. It's very friendly toward orthodoxy, and there's lots of Orthodox Catholic people that participate. For sure. I'm just saying that it definitely is predominantly Anabaptist.
I'd say that includes me. And I'm happy to.
I have a very Anabaptist streak within my theological thought, which is why I can.
All Christian anarchists do.
What was that?
As all Christian anarchists do.
Yeah, right.
And I consider myself similar. I mean, it's I'm very comfortable with deconstruction, and all the way down really to person, to spirit. And, I'm accused of nominalism at that point well, you're not saying anything then. But I do think there is something represented in the movement from Hegel's read of Christianity, as opposed to saying it all has to come from the top down. Like we just have to talk about this. Like what?
So here's where I see a kind of maybe a opening for dialogue between the Forging Plowshares perspective and what's going on in TLC, and that is in the phenomenon that Paul has observed and called metagelical, which is, I think, because there's definitely this kind of metagelical streak that runs through the very, very heart of TLC. And one of the aspects of this metagelical spirit is that it tends to be less factional. So to give you an example of things that like some metagelical things, I had a young Protestant guy on my channel. He's an evangelical. Not too long ago, his name was Luke, and we talked about the importance of Mary and why he's picked up the practice of praying the rosary. And my priest, Father Joe, he pays attention to this corner a little bit, but he also has a very metagelical streak. We pray for the Olympia CRC and our prayers for the people. In my Anglican church, when the new Pope was put into place, we prayed for the Pope. So there's this kind of like this metagelical thing has people like playing outside of the boundaries of the tradition that they're in without necessarily schisming and going into another church. Right?
I loved that video where Paul Vander Clay, I can't remember who he was talking to, but it was the evangelical to metagetical pipeline. Just a couple of weeks ago at the most, I would say.
Yeah.
Because they do reference exactly what you're saying. The extension of the emergent church is this orthodox moment of trying to see like, okay, well, we know Jonathan Peugeot is not a liberal, but he definitely breaks out of the evangelical comfort zone and the things that he says. And there's a whole lot of room there. I see. I'm right on with you. I wanted to jump in.
He's not a Christian nationalist either.
No.
Like him and Roland had a conversation. About a year ago, maybe, where they made a very coherent critique of Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
He said that he's a monarchist, but he's a Canadian, so that's not really saying much.
And so he's one that you would say is post-liberal.
Yeah, I think vaguely post-liberal, but I don't know how radically so. Mm-hmm. Like saying you're a monarchist when you're a Canadian, it's like, is he a monarchist in the sense that he doesn't believe in a constitutional form of government? I don't know.
Well,
if you believe in constitutional monarchy and representative democracy, and you call yourself a post-liberal, and you're Canadian, it's like, okay, that doesn't really alarm me much, because then at that point, post-liberal is just a semantic label that you've adopted because you have a defective definition of liberalism. That's what I would say.
Yeah. I consider myself a liberal, and I'm very much interested in talking about the alignment, I guess, is the best word I can think of now, between Christianity and forms of democracy as best political theory. I mean, and Jordan Peterson in this video I just referenced says he used to consider himself a liberal. And so he might be sort of looking for the boundaries of it too, but basically says you have to have I guess like Madison said, the context of a moral society in order to prioritize the individual.
Well, if you're okay, so this is where David Bentley Hart's Christ and Nothing essay comes into play, right? Like if your definition of liberalism is just based on a notion of individual rights and freedom, full stop, and that freedom, and you don't accept that freedom needs to be oriented toward anything whatsoever, and it's just like we don't, and your only doctrine is no restraints. That's not a healthy politics. But I don't ever think that's ever. I think that's a caricature of what liberalism has been throughout its history as a political movement.
I think it comes down to the desire to give Christianity credit for the good things in our society, and to give the declension narrative, the decline of Christianity, the blame for everything that's gone bad. And I think that's a bad position to take because you have to have a recognition of the whole complexity of that.
I think you can even take, I don't even think that's a dangerous position. I don't think even that is a threat to liberalism. As long as you lay the blame for the decline of Christianity where it belongs, which is at the feet of the church, because if Christianity is failing, how is that the government's problem? Mm-hmm. That is not the problem. That is not a problem for the state to resolve. The decline of Christianity in our culture is a church problem, and the church should fix it. That doesn't make all of a sudden, like, let's not have a separation of church and state anymore. Let's not have religious tolerance anymore. Let's like try to make it so that we have a law that punishes anybody that's not, a Christian. And how are we even defining a Christian at that point? Like, how are we even going to, what are we going to choose as our state church? Like, what are you even talking about?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd like to talk to you about sometime, I know we have time is something we can stack onto this with other videos, but I just know that talking about how Christianity is corrupted, and we could get all into Ivan Illich and the implications for our society and political theory of what's best for us. I mean, should we scrap liberalism? I don't think so. But and I know you don't think so. I think there's a lot that we can and should do, because there's actually no direction from there that we can go that's ever proved itself to be any better. And that where the problems of those positions, whether it's monarchy or Marxism or whatever, socialism, they are clearly delineated. And
can I bring this conversation together, these two different strands of the conversation? So the God that Peterson is pointing to, that is not contained in propositions, is a God that can be a foundational principle for a personalist expression of liberalism that is not tied to any particular faction.
Well, it's just the person, right? I mean, the God that you're describing is the God that's in you.
Is the person that births persons. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So it's just about
and the source of the fundamental dignity of those persons. Yeah, that's right.
I don't want to oversimplify, but it's about being a decent human being and wise in your judgments about all kinds of things, recognizing we can see things from the perspective of time, and everyone else sees things from this perspective, but we also have this treasure in earthen vessels. We have the perspective of eternity that's been laid bare out in front of us. It's been turned into a system itself and corrupted, and it's the foundation of our democracy, but it's also corrupt. And there's just a lot of moving parts that I think Christian discipleship and reorienting ourselves to reflect on what it means to have the mind of Christ in the modern world and how to behave in public. I loved what you and McMo were talking about in Romans 14. I did a deep dive into chapter 12 and 13 of Romans and was seeing the exact same thing. That it's the practical living out of love that is our witness. There's no system to it. There's no hierarchy. There's no thing that you can explain that makes meaning attractive in our world other than living according to the love that Christ has poured out on the world, and that we see means self-sacrificial, self-giving love and kenosis, and letting go of what you think is rightfully yours.
Right. Well, if you're thinking of hierarchy in terms of a God-given harmony of creation, I have no problem with it. Obviously, that kind of hierarchy is true. If you think the hierarchy is some sort of top-down structure that is given by God, you're wrong. You're obviously wrong, and the scriptures demonstrate that you're wrong.
I think the hierarchy is the body of Christ. I mean, that could be talked about a lot, but I just think that you're right about that. Hierarchy apparently was a word that Maximus himself avoided. I love that conversation. I think when were we talking about that before? That Dionysius, pseudo.
Oh, I think that was in one of our classes.
Must have been in the class.
Yeah.
That Maximus he took up the concept without ever taking up the word hierarchy, and which communicates something. Anyway, all right. I don't have any closing thoughts about Jordan Peterson except for God bless him. Yeah. And may we all be as inquisitive as he is, and also as critical as he is. Yeah,
I agree. Amen. Thank you, Brian, for joining me today to talk about Jordan Peterson's God and all the other things that we ended up talking about in the process.
Look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, we'll talk to you. We'll talk again soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.